Okay, our next discussion, which is our last session before lunch, is devoted to the enteric nervous system. And I'm going to have a few words to say about that, but we also have two experts. Victor Peikoff is here, and he, as many of you may know, in addition to being a contributor to our publication, is the CEO and founder of a startup in this space called MetaPace. And Victor, do you want to come up and have a seat at our panel? And I'm going to ask Jennifer French to have a seat at our virtual panel. Jen, are you on?
I'm here, Jen.
Great, we can hear you, and I'm going to load up your slides in a second. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give just a brief introduction of what you've been doing in the space and a little bit about your company. So, Victor, why don't you start and tell us about MetaPace and also anything else you're working on?
Actually work at two companies. One is MetaPace, that is focused on implantable solutions for GI disorders, specifically for autoimmune GI disorders. And another company called Transstimulation, which is doing wearable devices for acupoints for treating GI disorders. A variety, and we can talk later about the types of disorders can be treated, but it covers pain, functional disorders, and also autoimmune disorders.
Thanks. Jim, can I run the slides from my sharing my screen so everybody can see it in the room? Oh, can you all hear me?
Jen, yes, Jen, sorry. That would be great. Go ahead and share your screen.
Awesome. Well, first of all, before I share my screen, thanks, Victor, for holding out that table. My apologies that I couldn't be there today. Just logistics just couldn't work out, but thanks for allowing me to join virtually. So it's great to be here today. I think with introductions, and I know we have a lot to talk about in this space, I just thought we kind of set the table of what we're thinking in terms of the enteric nervous system. And knowing you, Victor, you've been in this space much longer than I have, but just wanted to give a couple of words of what we're doing in Neurotech Network and what we see the forward thinking in terms of the enteric nervous system, and hopefully we can this can lead to some further discussion with the panel. Very quickly, Neurotech Network, we're a nonprofit that focuses on education and advocacy, and really we have a lot of capacity elements that I'll go over in just a second, but really we focus in on those who are the potential end users and medical professionals. It's not just out to that way, it's also a two-way street of learning. So that's part of why we like to be at places like this, is to help the industry and developers understand the needs of those with lived experience in the community. So part of our capacity elements, we have the real stories, which Bionic Pioneers co-written with James on a collection of short stories of people living with the devices, but also a lot of education awareness. We have neurotech directories that we really kind of focus in on the lay person to help understand what technology is available and what is in the near pipeline. But we also do a lot in terms of co-learning on the community engagement and trying to connect developers, scientists, and those within industry with the groups of folks who are actually living with the condition. So yes, we're going to be talking about the enteric continuum. And this is a really interesting space because it's a very complex nervous system, but there's also intrinsic and extrinsic areas of neuromodulation, but understanding that there's a lot of anatomical locations where you can stimulate and be able to have a therapeutic effect. And I think this is still a frontier that we don't fully understand, but it's something that we can definitely explore and see where we can go in terms of addressing a lot of these end organs, but also connecting the continuum of the enteric system with the continuum of engagement. So We've done a lot of early engagement in terms of inputs and consultation. That's where you're starting to see, oh, we want to do surveys of the community, or we want to have advisory boards. But eventually, hopefully, we're starting to see more of a movement of co-creation and co-leadership, meaning that those with lived experience are much more involved in the development of the technologies, to really make sure that we're addressing the needs of those communities. So when we size markets, we always look at the total market size, the addressable available market, the serviceable obtainable market. But a lot of what we tend to fall in on in neurotech and a lot of other technologies is we like to focus in on those early evangelists. Those are the people who are going to adopt our technology right away. And it's easy to fall into this space to say, oh, well, I've talked to it and people who are early adopters, and this is what they think, but we have to remember to build a sustainable business. We have to go further down the pipeline. So how do we do that? So in sizing the market, which we do a lot in terms of this business space, we also have to really understand what we're doing. And what we're doing is really trying to understand that unmet need. And how do we unpack that unmet need? So we can count heads in populations, but more so, are we unpacking what's going to give us that differentiation when we go onto the market? So there's some guidance, there's older guidance out there from our regulators in terms of understanding patient preference information. This was 2016 guidance that was brought forward by FDA, particularly CDRH, and I think it's worthwhile for anyone in this room to be able to read this guidance and understand it before they go and do any type of submission. But there's a new program at FDA that just came out this year called the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program. And it's really kind of built off of this I shouldn't say old, but this published work that was done by both Heather and Jean back in 2017, looking at the total product lifecycle and how do we embed the lived experience voice in each one of these stages of development. And here are the goals of the program that they call TAP at FDA. But really, I want to focus in on this goal right here. This one I think is going to be really impactful for our development community, is really facilitating regular and solution-focused engagement with FDA review teams, but also participants and other stakeholders, including patients, providers, payers in the early device development. So this is very much in terms of FDA helping to facilitate the discussion of different stakeholders in going to looking at approved devices. So that the first part, it's just launched in January of this year. They're looking at focusing on cardiovascular first, but then it will expand out to other indications. And the funding brought forward for this was through MDUFA 5. If you're interested, this is the link right here to this program. I think it's something that could be of a lot of interest to this community. There's also frameworks that have been developed in the past in terms of understanding patient preferences. This is a paper that was published by folks at CDRH and their fellow partners in terms of building that type of framework. So many times when we go back and look at that total product life cycle, we always get asked, what's the risk versus benefit? And we love to go out to people with lived experience and say, how would you take this risk, and if we could give you this benefit, and they expect an answer out of it. But really, we have to look at a framework of how do we unpack that question. There is a framework that came out of a meeting and a workshop about patient preferences. And I think this paper is worthwhile for all of you to look through and understanding the patient preferences within this whole development life cycle. And I think this is worth a discussion of understanding what those questions are along the development pipeline. And let me give you two examples of organizations that are in the medtech space that really had to understand patient preferences. And this is one from Medtronic, believe it or not, in terms of their implanted defibrillator. And really, they found that there was a lot of hesitancy in terms of being implanted with this technology. And actually, they went out and did an extensive research study on patient preferences and what were some of the key elements. And they learned a lot from that. And they ended up actually relaunching a digital education program in specific countries where they saw a lot of hesitancy. And when they launched this, they actually found that the campaign really started to reach a larger audience, and they started to have some behavioral change in terms of decision making. So this is just one example of going out to those patient journeys and understanding the patient journey and speaking to patient, I like to call them community instead, of people living with chronic conditions and what their decision-making process is. Another one that brings a little bit closer to home and neuromodulation, and in terms of dealing with the enteric nervous system, specifically was the V-block system, right? So it was FDA approved, but really the study that they did not meet the endpoints. And this is a prime example of FDA actually went out and did a sponsored survey of the patients to really understand their willingness to accept the type of risk that they were doing with this device. And they learned a lot from this in terms of that's what helped to play into the device approval. So these are just two examples to give to you to really think about how we look at patient preferences. So how do we bring this back to really the enteric nervous system, and really how are we addressing disorders of gastrointestinal disorders? This was a paper published in 2019, really looking at what's the landscape in terms of neuromodulation for the enteric nervous system. So we're stimulating a lot of different areas to affect end organs. So looking at the vagal nerve stimulator, the gastric electrical stimulation, vagal nerve block, the sympathetic stimulation for IBD, really understanding some of the sacral nerve stimulation and mechanisms. So I think it's a wide area that we can start to address, and there's a lot of areas of discovery that still need to happen, but thinking about all the different modalities that we have in terms of addressing gastrointestinal disorders. And we don't need to have big budgets to do patient preference information, because the pharmaceutical industry has been doing this for a long period of time. And we can actually learn from what they've done in terms of discrete choice, in terms of patient preferences, and help to bleed that over into how we do the design and how do we address some of the unmet needs within the gastrointestinal disorder space. Here's a couple of examples for you. One is 64% of patients who want an active role in decision-making of surgical complications and treatments of gastrointestinal surgery. This was a discrete choice survey that was done and study that was done to really understand the hesitancy of people going into surgery and how they wanted to be involved in the decision-making process. Great study to help us understand the modalities and what questions we ask in terms of medtech. Another study that was done specifically for IBS was 48% of people with IBS prefer a dietary intervention over pharma or psychotherapy. And again, this was a discrete choice experiment. So discrete choice actually has people understanding and really making choices between risk and benefit. But that's something that maybe we should need to account for if we're looking to get into this space. Another area is fecal incontinence. So how do people determine success? So this was, again, a pharmaceutical study, but they found that 75% is the kind of key reduction of fecal incontinence for frequency, for that people consider it to be a success. So when we're looking at bars that we need to set in terms of preference, in terms of success matters, maybe we should need to listen to that population. And finally, the last one I'll give to you is 45% of people living with Crohn's disease who are risk adverse to either an adverse event or a course of prednisone. So meaning that they're very risk adverse in terms of trying new therapies, but think about how we address that when we're looking at risk versus benefit. So I think this hopefully brings home some of our discussion of this new area of neuromodulation, but also how are we adding into not just the sizing of the market, but also the unmet needs that we're trying to address within the gastrointestinal the gastrointestinal space. And neuromodulation, Jim, as you had noticed earlier, that pointed out earlier, it's getting to be a crowded space. There's a lot of devices coming and working into this space and building into the pipeline. So I think we're on a new frontier for neuromodulation, and I will leave it at that and turn it to the panel discussions for to Jim.
Great. Thank you very much, Jen. That was an excellent presentation. Touched on a number of issues that I hope we can follow up on in the discussion. But before we do that, I'm going to try and share a couple of articles that ran in our publication, the Bioelectrics Business Report. And I will share these articles with everyone. It'll be in the folder that you can download after the event. But a couple of research institutions that are doing some interesting work on the gut-brain axis and applications there, both on the stimulation and sensing side. And one is a institution called Weiss GI in Switzerland, and another is MIT. Here in the US. So let's see if I can share this article. And Sharina, are you with us? Are you able to join the conversation? So Sharina wrote this piece, an excellent piece talking about the Neuro GI program at the Wyss Center in Switzerland. And I don't know if we have Sharina. She's not. She was a moment ago. She's gone. Okay, sorry. Well, like I say, we'll send this article to. Is it showing up on Zoom? Are people able to see it? Okay, so this is a piece that she did a couple of months ago about an effort in Switzerland where they're developing new tools, and they're using a range of tools for anything from optogenetics to fMRI, and they're interested in probing. Both from a stimulation side and from a sensing side, to see how they can exploit these new opportunities in the enteric nervous system. The other article that we will share with you, and again we'll send this to you after the conference today. There's a researcher by the name of Polina Anikova. And she's at MIT. She gave one of the keynote lectures at the Society for Neuroscience in San Diego just a few months ago, which I thought was a fascinating talk. And her institution is developing new hardware devices, and they're interested in the gut-brain axis from both ends. So they're interested in stimulating the gut to produce changes in the brain, and conversely, stimulating the brain to produce changes in the gut. And it's not as easy as it seems, but they've developed some interesting new hardware, which this article discusses. I won't go into the weeds on it, but we definitely wanted to highlight these two institutions, the Wyss Center and MIT, that are very interested because it's not just that GI disorders are a potential, unmet need for neuromodulation and bioelectronic medicine, but also because the gut may give us a gateway to the brain. And in this article, Dr. Anikova describes experiments that they did at MIT to actually produce changes, brain and behavior changes in animals just by stimulating in the intestines. So with that, I'd like to just move into a more general discussion. Victor, you've been tracking this space for a while. Jen mentioned a number of applications and indications. Where are you most excited? Where do you think the greatest opportunity lies for bioelectronic medicine to solve unmet needs?
Well, let's start with guts before we go to the gut-brain.
Yes.
So the guts, there is kind of three main areas that have been already targeted by neuromodulation. One is so-called functional disorders, which cover motility, starting from aphasia, dysphagia, to GERD, to ileus and gastroparesis, to functional dyspepsia, to fecal incontinence and constipation. So covers the whole area. There is a whole bunch of devices already approved by FDA for this, including implantable, and the reason they work so well is because enteric nervous system works in coordination with autonomic nervous system to modulate propagation of motility, essentially. So motility is quite amenable, and this is something that is not easily druggable. So I think this is one example where drugs really do not work as well as the neuromodulation for functional disorders. And then the other two areas, one is kind of pain, which can be actually a lot of different reasons for pain, but typically it's some kind of increased sensitivity or hypersensitization in one part of the GI system. So for example, it could be due to surgery, removing something, let's say in a colon, there is a surgery, and then that creates some hypersensitivity in the colon, or could be some stress, chronic stress, and other reasons. So pain can be many reasons for causing pain, but neuromodulation, again, can treat the cause of pain, which is hypersensitivity, while drugs can only treat symptoms of pain, which is basically manifestation of that irritable bowel syndrome, for example, irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. And the third bucket is, of course, autoimmune disorders. And this is, again, area where currently drugs dominate, GSK and other companies. But currently, there is a whole bunch of companies trying to develop autoimmune suppression mechanisms through stimulating parasympathetic nervous system. So those are kind of three main areas in the guts itself.
Okay. And Jen, if I could, I'd like to throw a question at you. In addition to your work at the Neurotech Network, you've been intimately involved with the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium. And I'm wondering if you can talk for a little bit about the difference in needs, because not everyone's aware of this from this SCI community in terms of what would be different in developing a device and therapy for the SCI community that would be different from a device for the non-SCI community, and what could one learn from the other?
Interesting. Yeah. So thanks, Jim, for pointing that out. Yeah. So the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium was started back in 2018. We have a little over almost 450 members now throughout North America. And really, we're a coalition of organizations that represent people living with spinal cord injury directly and the various stakeholders. We did a partner with the research institution a couple of years back, and the paper was published in 2020 about looking at what are the attitudes and the needs of people living with spinal cord injury, particularly addressing neurogenic bowel and bladder. Understanding that's the top objective for those in that condition, and really understanding the attitudes between an implanted device versus an external device, and what are the concerns and what are the hesitancies within the community. So looking at from that study that was published, understanding implanted devices, one of the biggest concerns was having to go back for a revision surgery or having the device fail, which I think is, we could unpack that even more of understanding the behavioral implications of companies in the past that have tried to address this population. So that's were some of the main concerns, not necessarily the surgery, not necessarily the recovery, but it was much more about whether the device would fail and whether they had to go back for a revision surgery. For external devices, it was a little bit different in terms of the attitudes. the attitudes were much more about donning and doffing the device and having to deal with wires, really wanting a wireless system. So understand that if we're developing a wearable or we're developing something that people will take on and off for various uses, is to point in on the usability of the device for that specific population. So again, understanding what those preferences are, and we can bring that back into the design concepts of how we're trying to address that market.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And if I can follow up on that, one of the things, Jen, that we've observed over the years, and I'm not trying to make it sound like you're that old, but in the early days of neurotech reports, one of the first and most promising, application areas for neurotech was neuroprosthetics, and there were several companies that emerged to offer products for the spinal cord injury community, and got investment. But some of these companies failed, not because the technology didn't work, but simply because the market wasn't big enough, and some of these companies didn't have the staying power. Ironically, we're now seeing, 10, 15, 20 years later, that all of a sudden investors are very interested. And if you look at a company like Onward, which is the European company that was launched by or started by Professor Courtine at EPFL, they've done very well, both in terms of financially, but also in terms of results that they've been able to show with the SCI community. So my question to you, Jen, is what lesson is there for potential vendors of neuromodulation devices for gut? So, for instance, Axonics is a new player in the market, originally started at OAB, but almost as an afterthought, got into fecal incontinence because it's a huge unmet need. And of course, Medtronic learned this as well. But what I'm trying to get at is, in your opinion, or from your viewpoint, how can we encourage vendors such as Medtronic and Axonics and some of the other players who are developing therapies for the non-SCI market to look at either variations in their product or variations in their marketing to serve the SCI community?
Yeah, interesting question, Jim. Thanks for that. So, when we argue that SCI is a small market, yes, if you just look at the numbers, it is, but really, how are you addressing the unmet need? We can also make the argument that cystic fibrosis is a very small market, but that again was able to grab a significant investment in terms of coming to market. Now, the forces for pharmaceuticals is different than that for medical devices, and I will recognize that up front. But when we look at spinal cord injury, we also have to remember that a lot of devices have started off at spinal cord injury, but then built their development plans into larger markets. So when we think about spinal cord injury, particularly for addressing something in the gut, we have to think about neurogenic bowel and neurogenic bladder compared to overactive bladder. And how do we address those needs? There's a lot of other indications that live with neurogenic bladder or neurogenic bowel. So that can broaden that market, if you will, as we look at that. And I think that's where we're starting to see some of this investment in spinal cord stimulation or epidural stimulation, or, we love to come up with lots of different acronyms to make it sound like it's new, but the application of those can apply to a lot of different indications besides just spinal cord injury, where spinal cord injury can be a starting point. Listen, we know even from the BCI space is that we love to test things on people with spinal cord injury because they're stable, but we know that the broader market is going to be TBI and stroke and those others, which are a little bit more of an unstable indication.
Okay, thanks for that, Jen. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Is there anyone on Zoom who has a question? If not, anyone in the room that has a question for our panelists? Okay, if not, then I'd like to allow Victor and Jen to give any closing remarks on opportunities in the GI space or in the gut-brain axis that you see, or maybe something that isn't immediately obvious that we should be paying attention to. Victor, any closing remarks?
Yeah, well, it depends how many minutes I have, because GI and brain is a big topic, but if we don't have time for that, maybe we should not cover it now.
Well, take a few minutes if you want to delve into that. We'd love to get your
because
comments.
I think this is something that I really see a potential growth but also potential collaboration with biopharma is the gut-brain topic, which we haven't discussed yet, but is very exciting to me. But I don't know. So in one sentence, I would say that currently most of the pharma focused on the brain as the key source of neurological disorders. And the reason they did that is because I think if we talk about mood disorders such as depression or memory disorders such as Alzheimer's or some other brain disorders, the most of the receptors are there, but the pathways from the organs to the brain are the ones that are actually causing many of these mood and stress related and anxiety related issues. And so I think that this next decade will be actually more about finding specific pathways from specific organs such as GI and other organs which are actually causing distress to the brain. And once we go below the thalamus, which is kind of the main point where all these inputs integrate and get perceived by the cortex. And if we go below thalamus, we will see that the brainstem has a lot of centers that control individual autonomic organs. Yes. And so I think that's where we'll see a lot of interplay between biopharma, but we don't have time to discuss it. But
are you suggesting, though, that there's a lot of potential targets below the thalamus that the neuromodulation industry isn't exploiting at the moment?
Right. And one example of that would be that Parkinson also started initially as the kind of a striatal therapy, but now there is a lot of interest in going lower into brainstem for treating Parkinson. And I think the same thing will happen with other disorders.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks for that, Victor. Jen, any closing comments you wanted to add?
Yeah, great comment, Victor. I think another kind of key area is in terms of the vagus nerve. We're still doing a lot of exploration about how do we parse out that nerve to be able to impact other areas of gastrointestinal disorders. So I think that's a really interesting frontier for us to go down, as well as looking at areas that are really either minimally invasive or non-invasive to address this space. It, I think, is another area that we can explore that can help in terms of adoption for GI disorders. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I know.
Well, thank you for lunch. Thank you, Jen, and that concludes this session.